Sounds pretty big for an accident.
There are no accidents.
Thor, Tony, check it out.
The games industry has had a long and fairly prosperous relationship with superheroes, from the absolute apex of the genre with the likes of the Batman Arkham series and the more recent Spider-Man, to the bottom of the barrel like Superman 64. It will come as no shock to anyone that multiple studios have wanted to bring the Avengers into the gaming space, but with the mediocre track record of their previous tie-in games like Iron Man, there has been quite a lot of reluctance. The closest we ever got to an Avengers game was set to be released alongside the first Avengers movie. This wasn't going to be a tie-in game, but a first-person action brawler inspired by the Secret Invasion storyline, which would have been developed by THQ, but due to their financial trouble, the game never saw the light of day. Eventually, the game was retooled and became the lackluster Avengers Battle for Earth. Fast forward 5 years or so, and in 2017, a new Avengers game was teased, being developed by Crystal Dynamics, known best for their recently well-received reboot of the Tomb Raider franchise. This was set to be a much different superhero game. With the rise of the live service model, this new Avengers game had ambitions of standing alongside Destiny and Division, while evolving the game and its story for years to come. So now it's out and we've gotten hands-on. Does it stand up as one of Earth's mightiest games, or is it just another puny god? Let's find out, shall we? Welcome to TC Game, my name is Luke and I have been playing Marvel's Avengers. Quick side note, as this is a live service game, things are going to change after the video has been published. So this review is based mostly on the campaign and the current state of the game as a whole. Ever since the first trailer dropped for Avengers, the game got quite a lot of flack because of the knockoff MCU look, which is understandable, and Crystal definitely didn't help themselves by using character models that did look like MCU ripoffs to a degree. That being said, after a while I got pretty used to them and saw less of the MCU the more I played. All the characters look pretty good in their own right, each has a good variety of costumes to unlock, all with a good amount of attention to detail, some that are pretty much just palette swaps, some that has this game's own spin on them, and some more iconic looks from the comic books for you to work towards. Environmentally speaking, the game is also pretty good looking, with some varying surroundings from mountainside rocky terrain to vast snowy tundras, as well as some more familiar urban environments, even a short trip to space for the space cadets out there. There is never really a jaw-dropping moment with the game's visuals, but the game never really tries for that moment either. So overall, there's nothing spectacular visually, but it's all pretty good. Moving on to sound, voiceover is pretty good despite some very recognisable voices taking me out of the experience from time to time, but like with the visuals, after a few hours it does become a lot less noticeable, especially with the likes of Thor and Black Widow. Speaking of, Black Widow, voiced by Laura Bailey in particular, felt the most organic to me. Travis Willingham's Thor is adequately hammy. Jeff Shine brings a mature, commanding yet kind performance to Captain America, and while I do think Nolan North and Troy Baker are good picks for Tony Stark and Bruce Banner respectively, with Banner in particular getting a lot of depth in his performance, there is no mistaking who are behind those voices. Without question, Kamala Khan has the best performance, due in part to her more or less being the lead character, but regardless, from feeling her sense of joy to being a big old nerd during A-Day, to the sense of dread and uncertainty of having to leave her home and family behind her after she digs a little too deep for the truth about the A-Day disaster. For the most part, the cast is spot on and does well encapsulating each character. That being said, I would have liked something a little different from Tony Stark. While he does get his fair share of development, he remains the closest to his MCU counterpart, even at one point quipping about Cap swearing. While Nolan North does do a good job, it is almost too Nolan North. Something a little bit different to make the role more his own would have done wonders. As is, it sounds a little bit too much like a lot of his other roles for my liking. The score again is pretty good. While being different enough from the movie score, it feels very Avengers worthy, in the same way that Marvel's Spider-Man did in 2018. From the more subtle background of general traversal and exploration to the vastly more epic soundtrack to combat and especially boss encounters, Avengers does a more than adequate job of getting you hyped up for any encounter, even if none of the score is particularly memorable. Every attack has a good punchy sound effect behind it, which adds nicely to the overall weight of combat as well, and that goes doubly for Mjolnir and Cap's shield for that matter, both with hugely satisfying sound effects for every throw, block and attack. Moving on to the story, A-Day is a celebration of all things Avengers, with fan favourites like Iron Man, Cap, Thor, Bruce Banner and Black Widow all in town to unveil their new headquarters in San Francisco and their new Terrigen Crystal powered helicarrier. But of course, this being a superhero story, the bad guys know this is a great time to strike. Taskmaster and his minions attack the Golden Gate Bridge, drawing the attention of the Avengers, and while they are distracted, the bad guys destroy the new helicarrier with Cap trapped on board. The explosion causes a Terrigen mist to engulf the west coast, leading to numerous people getting infected by the mist, giving them unwanted powers, turning them into Inhumans. As a result of the A-Day disaster, and after a testimony from one Bruce Banner, the Avengers are disbanded. The story picks up 5 years later with Kamala Khan, now an Inhuman, who was of course at the A-Day celebration, trying to find the truth of A-Day, and after digging a little bit too deep is left with no choice but to leave her home and loved ones behind and try and reunite the Avengers to stop whatever the devious A.I.M is up to. The story feels like a good middle point of the slightly more grounded movies and the silliness of the comics, and while there aren't very many surprises, it is told pretty well with plenty of hints as to what is coming for those with a keen enough eye and somewhat of a comic book background. I have some of the same issues that I had with Spider-Man, mostly in that as cool as the final act is, it's just over far too quickly. I would have liked to have spent more time with the full team, which would have added much more impact to everything that happens in the final hours of the story. Admittedly, the story is nothing groundbreaking, but it is a good start and they've left plenty open to expand on and could create a cool self-contained universe. That being said, I do really hope that Sony changes their stance and uses their version of Spider-Man in the game. It wouldn't kill them to develop a small cameo that could slot into the Avengers world, and it would be a great way to really kick off the Marvel gaming universe. Plus, it would also go some way to justifying Sony gating off such a beloved character. My only major complaint story-wise is pacing. How certain missions are just resource gathering, which would normally be fine, but they come at really odd points in the story. For example, you are pretty much at the climax of the story, and instead of doubling down and battling their way to the big bad, you go out item farming. Why not just have the obligatory "there is no going back from here" or "this is your last chance to grind and farm for the final mission"? Whenever this occurred, it really threw me through a loop and completely took me out of the experience, because all you want to do is push on and take down the big bad, but then you're kind of pushed off to the side to do some resource gathering instead, completely playing off the urgency of the final mission. In terms of gameplay, Avengers is pretty ambitious. While Kamala is of course the main protagonist for the story, you play as each character in pretty equal measure, each with their own individual content, including a side story and harm room challenge. Each character has their own place in the story as well, and they never really feel unwelcome. Overall, each character follows the same gameplay archetype, yet each feel different enough to warrant playing with each character pretty substantially. Kamala Khan has the ability to stretch and transform her body, for example being able to enlarge her hands to smash her enemies. She is the most fun to play as, being pretty quick and powerful, being able to take on a large group of enemies just as easily and enjoyably for that matter as being able to traverse the environment. Hulk plays exactly as you'd expect, and honestly it's not as poorly as I was worried about. While he is my least favourite to use because he is a lot slower than the rest of the team and he can admittedly get a little repetitive and bland, in short bursts he is a lot of fun to play as, just brushing off enemies that would give other characters some challenge, especially when you get to rock'em sock'em with an equally large enemy. Iron Man was a bit underwhelming to play as at first, but he does get a lot more fun to play as the game goes on. He is pretty hard hitting and has some good range due to his repulsors, which are his primary form of attack, and while the first on rails flying section left a lot to be desired, the subsequent flying sections are a lot more fun due to having a lot more room to maneuver. Black Widow is one of my favourite characters to use because she is one of the weaker heroes, but her agility is unmatched in the team and she has a really satisfying hard hitting special attack. She actually feels a lot like Lara Croft in her general movement, which is not a bad thing. And Thor is also a lot of fun to use. He's got a good amount of weight to all of his attacks, and while he is no Kratos, throwing Mjolnir around is still pretty satisfying on the whole. Each character has a plethora of upgrades available to them, from new primary attacks that can be used in general combat, like jumping attacks for example. Specialty skills upgrade the character's heroic abilities, from increasing the amount of time heroes can use their special ability like Kamala's Embiggen, or increasing the damage of their other heroic abilities. And finally there are mastery skills, which are a little different to the other upgrades, as once you unlock an upgrade you can then only pick one of the 3 in that path at a time, but these can be swapped out freely. As mentioned, there are a lot of cosmetic items to be unlocked in Avengers, from a range of outfits both inspired by comics and colour swaps of previous in-game outfits, emotes fitting each character, takedowns which are the combat animations that occur when you hit the button prompt on staggered enemies, and finally nameplates that are used as a background for your player ID. Barring the outfits that are unlocked through the campaign, everything else here is unlocked through each character's challenge card, which is Avengers' very own battle pass. Everything at the time of recording is unlockable through gameplay. However, the furthest I got with a character after completing the main campaign was halfway through level 4 with Iron Man, out of 40 levels. Now, while I do think the Battle Pass is a good way to encourage players to keep playing after finishing the main campaign, I would have liked at least the first 6 levels, which would have got you your first outfit in the Battle Pass, to be more achievable through the campaign. Again, the Battle Pass as is a good way to encourage people to keep playing beyond the campaign, but it does leave the campaign feeling a little bit unrewarding.
Hey, Bruce.
Like with any superhero game, or most games in general these days, there are of course collectibles to be found. Not too many, thankfully. These consist of various iconic comic books from each character's history. Intelligence, which are audio logs that fill in a lot of the backstory of certain events and points throughout the main campaign. While I really like the addition of comic books, I didn't really care too much for the audio logs. In general, I'm kind of fed up with audio logs being a collectible. It was a cool way to add depth 10 years ago, but now not so much. Finally, you will unlock codex entries with each enemy you encounter and location visited. Each one gives a little bit of comic book and in-game history of said character and location. Speaking of enemies, there aren't many boss fights throughout the campaign, and you only really fight 3 supervillains, with the others being mechs of some description. And honestly, none of these boss fights really blew me away. Taskmaster was far too easy, but he is used as an introductory boss, so that is somewhat excusable. It just doesn't feel like a great use of such an interesting character, to me at least. The fight with Abomination is fun enough, being a slugfest with the Hulk. And from here until your final fight with M.O.D.O.K, you fight robots, and while each one does have their challenge, they were all just kind of underwhelming. Even the majority of the final fight is a bit too run-of-the-mill, when there could have been so much more done with the available characters. That being said, the finale of the final fight is truly a spectacle. Also worth a quick mention is the harm room, which is basically a challenge room where you will at first learn how to use each character and get to grips with their unique abilities, and then you'll be able to partake in some challenging combat simulations, defeating wave after wave of increasingly difficult enemies, which puts everything you've learned up until this point to the test, and generally are quite challenging towards the end.
If I had hands, I would have pulled.
Finally, performance-wise, I didn't have as much trouble as I was anticipating. That being said, I did encounter a noticeable amount of pop-in, a bit of stuttering here and there, and there was a few times towards the climax of the story where the frame rate would absolutely tank when there were too many enemies on screen at a time. I also noticed some oddities in cutscenes, such as Bruce losing his beard and Kamala losing her hair, which also happened in the beta. Or, for instance, Kamala complimenting Tony on his new Iron Man armor, despite him not actually wearing his Iron Man armor. He's just in his normal clothes in that scene.
Nice suit!
I also noticed occasionally characters would have dialogue, but they would just flat out stop moving their mouths about halfway through. Apparently San Francisco is a hotbed for ventriloquists. Who knew?
Thanks. I'm Sarah Garza, and the whispers about you are already fierce.
Load times are pretty bad, which will and has already discouraged people from continuing playing the game after a death. And I encountered a really odd issue when playing as Thor when he rejoins the story. He would literally die in about 2 hits, but then after getting frustrated in closing and restarting the game, the issue resolved itself, really oddly. Oh, and this weird thing here happened. Don't quite know how to describe it, but there it is.
Located in the containment cell.
Overall, the game performed pretty well despite the occasional, if glaring, issue.
Fanfiction contest, here I come.
I, for obvious Spidey-shaped reasons, played this on the PlayStation 4 Pro, but I really wish that Spider-Man would have just been available on other platforms so I could just play this all on my PC. I would happily pay for the Spidey stuff if I could just play this on my PC, because I don't doubt some, if not most, of these graphical issues I encountered are largely due to the limitations of the PS4. I really enjoyed my time with the Avengers main campaign, and while I did encounter a few frustrating issues, overall the campaign is a good foundation for this game to build on. I'm really looking forward to see if they can expand on this with the additional characters and their stories, and seeing where the game can go on from there. Combat is fun for the most part, the characters are well written and performed, and while some of the boss fights were underwhelming, there's still plenty to enjoy here. I genuinely believe if they can iron out the kinks and keep consistently adding good quality to the game, it can stand alongside the likes of Destiny and Division with pride, but only time will tell.